Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're digging into some really fascinating research, stuff that touches almost everyone. How our demographics, things like age or where we live, shape our faith.
Right.
You might think your own sense of religiosity is just this fixed internal thing, but the sources we're looking at today, they paint a much more dynamic picture.
That's really the core idea here. What the academic work shows pretty clearly is that religiosity isn't static. It's not something you're just born with. It's more like a complex, fluid pattern.
A personal interpretation of your spiritual life.
Exactly. And it's constantly being shaped by, well, almost everything. Your education, your income, even your zip code.
So our mission in this deep dive is to give you a kind of shortcut through all that academic research. We're looking at how faith levels connect with 6 big variables: gender, age, education, socioeconomic status, or SES, locations like rural versus urban, and marital status.
And maybe the biggest takeaway right up front is that context is just crucial. We're going to see findings that completely flip depending on the culture being studied.
Oh, really? Yeah. What seems true in the US or Europe often looks totally different when you look at, say, parts of the Middle East or Asia. It highlights that there are, probably as many ways to be religious as there are people who believe.
Okay, let's unpack those first two factors then, starting with gender. Now, I think the conventional wisdom, at least in the West, for decades has been that women are generally more religious than men. Higher church attendance, more prayer, feeling closer to God. Is that what the research actually shows?
Well, that is the dominant story for Western samples, yes.
Yeah.
U.S. and European studies, they consistently show women scoring higher pretty much across the board. We're talking belief, emotion, active worship.
Okay. So why? Why do the sources suggest this difference exists, generally speaking?
Researchers point to a few things. One is psychological. There's some statistical basis to the idea that women might perceive greater risk or experience more anxiety, which could foster a stronger reliance on divine protection or comfort.
And also, faith often gives women a kind of recognized platform, a way to legitimize more traditional roles, like being the family guardian or the moral educator for children.
Right, that makes sense. But here's where you said it gets surprising. When the research focus shifts, maybe to certain Eastern or Muslim contexts, you're saying the pattern can actually flip, men scoring higher sometimes.
Yes. Sometimes, quite dramatically. Men might score higher on specific metrics, like, say, definitive belief in core tenets or carrying out certain public worship practices.
Wait, how did the sources explain that? It seems like a direct contradiction.
It often comes down to a structural issue more than just individual belief. In many Muslim societies, how faith gets expressed is really tied to social access.
Social access.
Yeah, men often have more freedom, fewer constraints when it comes to organized public participation, attending the mosque regularly, going to formal lectures, engaging in religious discussions outside the home.
Ah, I see. So if our measure of religiosity is based heavily on those public communal activities?
Then women, whose primary roles may be as homemakers, spouses, mothers, might limit their time or their ability to move around freely. They could score lower simply because the social structure restricts their outward expression of faith.
Even if their internal belief is just as strong or stronger.
Precisely. It's a perfect example of how social roles can filter the way faith looks on the outside, regardless of the internal feeling.
Wow, that's a huge distinction to make. Okay, let's pivot to age. The common idea is that faith just sort of increases steadily as we get older. Older people are the most devout. But our sources are saying the lifespan curve isn't quite so simple.
Definitely not linear. Researchers used to talk about maybe 3 different models for how faith changes with age. But the pattern that shows up most consistently in Western studies, and actually many global ones too, is what they call the dip and rise.
The dip.
Yeah.
Okay, I think a lot of us can probably relate to that one, that feeling in maybe early adulthood.
That dip lines up really strongly with the 18 to 30 age range. Think about it. It's when young adults gain this radical independence.
Right. Moving out, maybe university.
Exactly. Moving away from home, entering totally new social circles, prioritizing secular goals like building a career, finding a partner, just figuring out how to pay the rent. You're essentially moving away from the family structure that might have supported your faith before.
And there's often a lot of questioning then too, right? Doubt.
Oh, absolutely. It's a period of high religious doubt and exploration for many. Faith kind of gets put on the back burner while they focus on becoming functional adults and navigating all these new freedoms.
So when does the rise part kick in? When does faith start trending upwards again?
It generally starts picking up noticeably around the mid-30s to mid-40s, and this renewed interest seems directly linked to major life events.
Like what?
Confronting mortality, maybe achieving those early career goals and realizing they don't bring ultimate meaning. And very crucially, becoming parents.
Ah, parenting. That changes everything.
It really does. Suddenly you feel this need to transmit moral values, maybe seek guidance that goes beyond the material success you were chasing in your 20s. The search for meaning often comes back, sometimes quite strongly.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
Faith responds to where we are in life.
Yeah.
Now let's shift from our sort of personal timeline to the bigger structures around us, starting with education. You might think, okay, the more you learn, maybe the stronger your faith gets. But the sources throw a big curveball here. It seems to depend heavily on what kind of education you get.
That is absolutely the key distinction. If the curriculum is specifically faith-focused, if you're studying theology, taking Quran courses, attending a religious school, then yes, there's generally a positive correlation. Higher education level tends to mean higher belief, knowledge, and practice.
But the typical path, say a secular university program, studying engineering or literature or whatever, that often shows an inverse relationship. As education level goes up, adherence to practices like daily prayer might go down. How does that work? Shouldn't more knowledge strengthen conviction?
It often changes the type of conviction, is what the research suggests. That inverse correlation seems to happen because secular higher education exposes students to critical thinking, academic inquiry, and sometimes viewpoints that are explicitly secular or rationalist. These can challenge traditional, maybe inherited, beliefs. So the daily practice might drop off, but the faith itself doesn't necessarily disappear.
So it's more of a quality shift than quantity.
Exactly. You could say lower education levels often correlate with a faith that's perhaps simpler, but often very sincere and heartfelt. Higher education, on the other hand, might correlate with a faith that's less actively practiced in traditional ways, but maybe more rationalized, internally consistent, perhaps more intellectually structured.
Moving from an emotional faith towards a more intellectual one.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Okay, that's a great summary. Let's talk money now. Socioeconomic status, SES. Across most Western studies, religious activity seems largely driven by the middle-income group. But when we look at some other global research, we see this really interesting, almost counterintuitive thing. The upper-income class sometimes shows the most indifference towards religion.
Yes, and some specific findings like those from research in Turkey, for example, really illustrate this broader trend of upper-class detachment pretty well. These studies show the middle and lower classes are generally more religious, while the wealthiest group, they tend to be the most distant.
Why would being wealthy and highly educated, especially in these sort of modernizing societies, seem to pull people away from faith?
Well, three reasons pop up consistently in the sources. First, there can be a direct conflict between a certain kind of westernized, modernized lifestyle, which the wealthy often adopt first, and specific religious rules. Think about finance, business ethics, maybe entertainment habits. Faith can start to feel like an inconvenience.
It gets in the way of their modern life choices.
Precisely. Second, that higher education we just talked about. It often leans heavily secular or positivist, driven by science and rationalism. This can foster a mindset that's more distant, sometimes even skeptical, towards traditional religious doctrines.
Okay, that connects back. And the third reason.
The third is interesting. It's about how children are raised in affluent families. They're often caught in what one source called the private school tutoring home triangle.
Tell me more about that triangle. What's the effect?
It basically means their schedules are absolutely jam-packed with activities aimed at optimizing them for secular success, academics, sports, arts. There's often very little time left for voluntary religious education or even just participating in community faith activities.
So religion becomes the one subject they didn't get tutored in?
Effectively, yes. This can lead to a kind of religious illiteracy, and then later, maybe alienation because they don't fully understand the faith tradition they might have technically inherited.
So whether we're looking at that Western middle-income focus or the Turkish upper-class indifference finding, the general conclusion seems to be the highest levels of religiosity are often found in the middle SES group, then maybe the lower group, with the upper SES folks showing the least active engagement or interest.
That's a fair summary of the overall trend, yeah. Hashtag tag environment and relationship status.
Right, let's turn to where we live, our environment. Is there a consistent finding when we compare city life to country life?
Oh, this one's remarkably consistent across studies. Rural almost always comes out ahead in terms of religiosity. People living in rural areas, villages, small towns, they consistently show significantly higher levels of religious belief and practice and adherence to traditional views compared to people in big cities or major provinces.
What is it about the city? What's the urban effect that seems to weaken faith? Is it just the anonymity?
Anonymity is part of it. Cities tend to weaken the traditional social mechanisms that often support faith. You generally have looser social relationships, right? More individualism.
Huh.
And crucially, a loss of informal social control.
Meaning?
Well, in a small village, everyone knows if you skip the main religious service, your neighbors notice. In a city of 5 million, nobody knows, nobody cares. That lack of social accountability, combined with the rise of a modern, often secularized standard of living, it just makes faith feel functionally less essential for day-to-day navigating.
That difference is really stark. One of the sources we looked at mentioned a study where the rate of people saying religion was unimportant in their daily life was 2.5 times higher among city dwellers compared to rural residents. That's huge.
It really shows how quickly urbanization can shift life's priorities away from maybe more traditional spiritual concerns. Now, let's look at who we live with or don't. Marital status. The general finding is that married people tend to be more religious and more engaged in religious practices than single people.
Okay, but is that just because single people are often younger, maybe falling into that 18 to 30 age dip we talked about earlier?
Sure. That's a big part of it, yes. The single population overlaps heavily with that adolescence and young adulthood phase, which, as we said, is often defined by religious doubt, searching for independence, that sort of thing. But the data gets really interesting when we look at people who've left the married status, either through widowhood or divorce.
Okay, what do we see there?
Well, the widowed population typically shows very high rates of religious behavior. Things like frequent prayer, strong belief in the afterlife. This is definitely tied to often being older, but also to that critical psychological need. Using faith to cope with loss, maybe hoping for reunion with a loved one in the next life, religion becomes a really powerful coping mechanism.
That makes intuitive sense.
Yeah.
And then the divorced population.
That group often shows a surprisingly high rate of disinterest in religion. One study we saw noted that about 25% of divorced individuals expressed no interest in religion at all.
Wow. That raises a bit of a chicken and egg question, doesn't it? Is a weaker faith maybe a contributing factor before a marriage breaks down? Or does the trauma of divorce itself cause people to lose faith or turn away?
It's likely a bit of both, I think. But the sources tend to lean towards the idea that a strong religious faith might act as a key resource for coping with marital problems, or maybe even serve as a kind of deterrent against divorce in the first place for some couples. So when that marriage bond breaks, the religious connection can weaken significantly too.
Okay, this is fascinating. Let's try to pull all these threads together now. The age dip, the need for comfort when facing loss, that tension between doubt and conviction. Can we sort of map out the major stops on a typical human spiritual journey from childhood through old age based on these findings?
Yeah, I think we can synthesize this for the listener. The journey really begins in childhood, let's say roughly ages 3 to 7. This stage is often defined by what researchers call acceptance without questioning.
Taking things literally.
Very much so. Faith is highly egocentric. God is often seen in really concrete, almost human-like terms, a big person, maybe a father figure in the sky, and prayer. It's usually pretty transactional. It's plan B for getting what you want or for feeling protected.
Then comes the teenage earthquake.
Exactly. Adolescence, maybe 13 to 18, is the critical crisis period. This is when abstract thought really kicks in. Suddenly, teens can grapple with big abstract concepts, core religious doctrines, the meaning of right and wrong, the classic problem of evil.
Which leads to questions, lots of questions.
Immense religious interest often flares up alongside intense doubt and questioning. They're searching for their own identity, for independence, and faith often becomes a major arena for that struggle, especially when traditional beliefs clash with modern concerns like, say, sexuality.
Okay, and if they navigate that crisis, they move into adulthood, where we saw that dip and rise pattern.
Right. So adulthood covering young and middle age is generally where faith starts to stabilize. If it persists, it often becomes a more consciously chosen commitment. You move away from maybe the emotional dependence of childhood towards a more rational structure for your beliefs. And critically, as we discussed, middle age, say 35 or 40 plus, often sees that revitalization.
The rise.
The rise. Focus shifts towards existential meaning, maybe starting to prepare for mortality, pursuing spiritual maturity. Sometimes this involves exploring deeper mystical or contemplative practices.
And finally, that stage, often linked with the widowed population we discussed. Old age, maybe 60 plus.
This tends to be a period of consolidation. Religion often functions as a really crucial psychosocial adjustment tool. Practice, especially things like prayer frequency, often remains high or even increases. Faith provides vital comfort for coping with accumulating losses, friends passing away, loss of mobility, changes in family structure.
And security in the face of death.
A huge part of it.
Yeah.
Offering security, focusing strongly on the afterlife, seeking forgiveness, finding peace with the life lived. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow. This has really painted an intricate map of how faith develops and shifts across a lifetime. I think the overarching takeaway for me is just how unique and constantly adjusting religiosity really is. It's clearly shaped by this continuous interplay between our internal development, moving from that egocentric childhood faith through the questioning teenage years and these powerful external markers. Things like the type of education we get, the economic class we find ourselves in, and even the simple fact of whether we live in a bustling city or a quiet town.
Absolutely. It's this dynamic dance between the personal and the social. And, if we pause on that, finding that higher socioeconomic status and certain types of education can actively push individuals towards religious indifference, well, it does raise an important question for you, the listener, to maybe mull over.
What's that?
What does this potentially tell us about the future landscape of faith in societies that are becoming increasingly urbanized and increasingly highly educated? Where might that trend lead?